Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Gildardo Lopez wash processed Colombia from Thankfully Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And thankfully, I believe previously based out of Auburn, Alabama, because their bags now say Waverly, Alabama. So for purposes of this review, we'll go with based out of Waverly, Alabama. But this coffee is one half of our April 2025 Coffee of the Month nominees, as it won our Instagram poll as the coffee you most want to see us review. And thankfully is a coffee roaster that has appeared on this channel on numerous occasions, including last year when we reviewed one of the other Copa de Oro finalists. And if I'm being completely honest, I wasn't too interested in reviewing this coffee or too many of the Copa de Oro finalists this year, largely because I didn't necessarily have the best experiences with the ones that we reviewed last year, as I affectionately dubbed it a competition to see which Colombian coffee can taste the most like a Kenyan coffee. And with this one sounding very much like a Kenyan coffee, it didn't necessarily appeal to me as much as some of the other coffees that thankfully had released at that time. But given that it did win our Coffee of the Month poll, we did decide to pick it up. So it'll be interesting to see how it turned out, as this right here is day 50. And recipe we went with for this coffee was actually a toned down one at a 15:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 94 degrees Celsius, about 201 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which does indicate a more medium fine grind roast profile for this coffee. So we did a follow-up poll to determine whether or not we were going to go with the standard profiles of this coffee as well as the Gildardo Lopez that we're reviewing from September. And unsurprisingly, the extra light profile of both these coffees won in a significant landslide. And it is kind of funny because both Thankfully and September said that they would have preferred that we reviewed their standard profile. Now, when comparing them alongside each other, as we'll also be reviewing the September extra light version of this coffee, I would say that this one actually wasn't too far away from that September extra light, as Thankfully doesn't roast quite as light as September on a general basis. But this one right here, I would say, was somewhere between the standard profile that we received from September. We received a sample of that, which was also still very light, and a little bit closer to that extra light profile of the September coffee than we might have expected going into it. I feel like the difference was honestly not that noticeable. So for that reason, I can say this is one of the lighter coffees we've had from Thankfully in general, and this one definitely skews on the very light side of things by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 22, first impressions. So they did suggest a 3-week rest period for this coffee, and that's the reason we started at day 22. Opted for the V60, and the coffee is everything we expected it to be. So it's bright, clean, and sweet with all of the listed qualities presented in a prominent and well-defined sense. Berry at the forefront, plenty of citrus brightness, as well as a lovely candied sugary sweetness in the finish, and a slightly sweeter Kenyan-like feel as a result. So it was a pretty nice start, and that is in line with what I had previously said about last year's Copa de Oro, where a lot of the coffees did remind us of Kenyan coffees, and that was kind of the first impression of this coffee, is that it was pretty Kenyan-like, if anything, just a little bit sweeter. Day 25 through the Chemex, and the coffee was a little less impressive this time around, as there's a little less of the candied sweetness, as it's skewing much more on the Kenyan bright side of things. A bit more of a tart profile that is pretty direct, with a notable sugariness that is in line with a listed cotton candy, and an overall red tone to this coffee. So I don't think that there's really too much outside of the box when it came to the first couple of impressions of this coffee. And as we go through this review, it's kind of similar in that sense. This one just presents this profile. It presents it very well, and it's very pronounced. So it's not surprising that the notes that Thankfully had listed for their coffee and the ones that September had listed for their coffee were the exact same. And it's largely because this is just kind of what this coffee was. Day 28 through the UFO brewer, and the coffee is a little bit better, as it's okay off brew with some strong red berry and citric qualities to it, but on the back end is where this coffee is really at its best, offering a strong sugary sweetness to it and a slight Kenyan-like aftertaste in the floral sense. So there's at least a little bit of additional depth to it this time around. Sweetness is very high though, with some excellent clarity. So for that reason, it appeals to me a little bit more. It's basically like a Kenyan coffee, a little bit sweeter and a little bit cleaner. So that did seem to help this one. Day 31 through the V60 with some higher extraction adjustments, and Alex from Thankfully did reach out to us before we ever started brewing this coffee and said, push this coffee. So that's the direction we decided to go, 17:1, 99 Celsius, and a more fine grind. And the coffee does continue to perform well in this brew method, with the best coming in the finish, as it's offering plenty of those strong sugary aspects yet again. It's been consistent. If anything, this really just seemed to accentuate a lot of the brighter and more citric qualities of this one, and it was paid off at the end with more of that sugary sweet quality. However, I don't necessarily think that that was worth the trade-off for me specifically, and I think that Alex likes Kenyan coffee significantly more than I do, so it would make a lot of sense why he might have suggested pushing this one in the way that he did. Day 34 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and the coffee wasn't quite as good this time around, as there seems to be a pretty noticeable difference between the brew methods, which is going to be very funny when we discuss the September coffee actually, because I found significantly better results with the V60 for this coffee than I did with the Chemex, and it just really seemed to accentuate a lot more of those citric qualities, even more so when we did push this one compared to the V60. Reminiscent of Kenyan coffees with a lot of the berry qualities at the forefront yet again. So mixed impressions, probably my least favorite day of the coffee up to that point. Day 37 through the V60 with some lower extraction adjustments, so a 15-1 at 94 Celsius, and the coffee was the best it had been to this point. And there's a pretty notable reason for why that was, as it had less of those Kenyan-like qualities for me, which I was more than happy to tone down. I didn't need a lot of the brightness to it. I didn't need a lot of the tart Kenyan or lime-like aspects of this coffee. It allowed for greater focus on the sugary qualities, which is what I was going for in this coffee. The listed cotton candy is really enjoyable. It's in a much more defined and pronounced sense this time around. So having that be at the forefront, having that be a little bit more intense, definitely did play into my preferences. Day 40 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and the coffee was the best it had been to this point with this brew method, as I can say it emphasizes a lot of the more refined sugary qualities. A strawberry cotton candy combination would be a very apt descriptor, maybe even a strawberry lollipop. So it was only at this time when we did kind of tone down this coffee, I was able to say, I'm getting a little bit more from this coffee. I can kind of see a little bit more of the idea and thought process behind this coffee. It's a lot more sweet in that sense, and it's offering a little bit more depth as opposed to just a super citric, a super bright, a super tart forward experience that we had had up to that point. Day 43 through the V60 with those lower extraction adjustments, and it honestly felt like there might have been a slight misbrew, as it did feel a little bit more citric forward than it had in some of the previous days. Even then, there was plenty of the sweetness in the finish, which was still the best part of me when it came to this coffee. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. All right, let's go through this one, and we have quite a few level 4s, and I will be completely honest, I did look at the September tasting wheel right before I started this review, and there's only one thing that's different between these two tasting wheels, and we'll discuss that in the September review. But let's go through this one real quick. We have a lot of level 4s, the cleanliness there at the level 4 mark, so super clean cup of coffee, and I was very happy with that. I think, what is this one, a pink bourbon coffee, and it makes a lot of sense given that it acted that way throughout the entirety of this coffee. So level 4, where we opted to put that. It's basically a Kenyan coffee with a much more defined profile to it and significantly less of the tomato-like savory characteristics to it. I can see it. We'll discuss that maybe a little bit more in the September review, but level 4, where we opted to put that, I really don't have any qualms whatsoever about the overall cleanliness and clarity of this coffee. Finish, level 4. Finish is the best part of this coffee for me, as it definitely had a lot of that refined sugary quality to it, and I really love the cotton candy note listed on here, because I would have otherwise described it as essentially just being sugar, given that it's just so sugary in that artificial-like sense, which I enjoy, especially when it's presented in the finish in a much more pronounced sense for sweetness. That's why I'm also very happy that the sweetness did score there at that level 4 mark. If anything, it's on the higher side of the sweetness when it comes to pink bourbon coffees for me, so I'm very happy with that scoring as high as it did. Historically speaking, I feel like this might have changed more recently. Pink bourbon coffees did have a pretty quick drop-off point. I think I see that still quite a bit from some of the Bots pink bourbon coffees that we've had. So it could be that maybe the more developed pink bourbon coffees do tend to drop off a little bit quicker than the lighter ones. But this one right here, I didn't see a drop-off. If anything, I actually think it might be better today when we brewed it. Acidity level 4, very bright coffee. I think I was fully expecting that going into it. I think it's probably the biggest selling point to a lot of people on this coffee, and you can even go higher on that if you really want to push this coffee. You can get plenty of those Kenyan-like bright characteristics to it, so not surprising we have that as high as it is. What are the notes that they have listed on here? Is it just generic red berry, or do they have strawberry specifically? It is strawberry. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. All right, let's go ahead and move on. Florality level 4. I don't think that they had any sort of floral descriptor on there, but given that there's a very strong red theme to this coffee, I'm definitely experiencing a little bit more of those red qualities in terms of the floral sense. So I'm actually thinking a little bit more along the lines of something like a rose, given that it doesn't have that super strong herbality that comes from Kenyan coffees. So that works for me. Level 4, where we opted to put that. Let's go ahead and move on through the rest. Berry fruit, level 4. Strawberry, that makes a lot of sense given that it's not quite as tart as a lot of the Kenyan coffees, so it is a little bit more sweet, especially in that artificial sense. So strawberry makes a little bit more sense for me in that sense, but I'm very happy that it's not that more fermenty, artificial strawberry that comes with more processed coffees, especially Colombian coffees. Citrus fruit, level 4. If there's a sticking point to me on this Gildardo Lopez in general, it's that the lime was as high as it was, and I'm not the biggest fan of lime in coffee. I don't particularly love a lot of the more tart citric aspects or bitter citric aspects of coffee, so level 4, it's fine. It is what it is with this coffee. Let's go ahead and move on to the level 3s. We just have one of them, body level 3. Plenty of texture in this one. I think that was fully expected going into it. And then final thing worth discussing, caramel level 1. Or level 2. I honestly think it's only that low largely because of the possible misbrew when I was actually making this tasting wheel. I probably would have bumped that up a little bit higher on the preceding days just based off of the very prominent sugary sweetness that we did experience from those. So level 2, where we opted to put that, I think that's kind of the only argument I might have on this tasting wheel. Because outside of that, as I'm looking at this, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. The main reason I decided to start with this review is because we started this one earlier, and that's because we actually received this one before I ever received that September coffee. I mentioned in some of our monthly recaps that it was tricky if we were going to even end up getting that September coffee due to some kind of miscommunication and errors and some things. So for that reason, I think we had started this coffee before we'd ever received that September coffee to begin with. And the September coffee did recommend a little bit more rest time than this one did. But outside of that, I largely want to save the majority of my thoughts for this coffee when comparing and contrasting it to the September version of it as well. But as far as it goes for this Gildardo Lopez in general, I thought it was nice. If anything, I enjoyed it significantly more than the Copa de Oro coffees that we had last year. So probably my favorite Copa de Oro coffee that we've had as of this moment. We are reviewing at least one other different one from Coffee County. So stay tuned for that, and also stay tuned for the September review because I definitely think we'll kind of dive into this one a little bit more in that review as well. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. It still offers plenty of those Kenyan-like characteristics, so that's the first place I want to start. It does present them in a sweeter, cleaner, and less savory tomato-like sense, so that was a really nice selling point to me on this one. The best selling points to me on it specifically is that you can adjust it a little bit more to your own preferences. So you can push this one, get a little bit more of those bright, citric, tart characteristics to this one, or you can kind of tone it down and get a little bit more of that sugar-forward sweet experience that I was preferring when it came to this coffee. So it's versatile in that sense. Kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to hear your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Gildardo Lopez wash processed Colombia from Thankfully Coffee. Thank you for watching.